is an urban forestry specialist with the North Carolina Forest Service Urban Community Forestry Program. She has a bachelor's of science in natural resources ecosystem assessment from North Carolina State University in 1995. She has 23 years of urban forestry related experience in both public and private sectors. Jennifer began her career in the NC Forest Service in 1999 before serving as the urban forestry coordinator for the town of Wake Forest here in North Carolina. Then as a project manager and consultant for a landscape contractor. She joined the Forest Service again in 2019. She is a ISA certified arborist, municipal specialist, and is a tree risk assessment qualified. So Jennifer is going to talk about mitigation, what we can do to mitigate the tree damages from storm events. Take it away, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Leslie, confirming you can see my slide presentation.
Yes, you're good to go.
All right, great. So getting started this morning, wanted to cover a little bit of terminology that you'll hear. I know in the Forest Service or in any profession, we have our own jargon, our own language sometimes, and people don't often understand what we mean. So real briefly, we'll cover a little bit of terminology so that as I go through the presentation, you'll understand the terms that I'm using and what I'm referencing when we talk about trees and looking at trees. We'll talk a little bit about tree risk identification and that process, and the process for visually assessing a tree for potential risk factors. And we're going to specifically look at what to look for each component of a tree, and then talk a little bit about mitigation options. But before we begin, I've got a poll question, if Leslie wants to pull up the poll.
Yep, it is live. So it's my community regularly inspects public trees for risks and completes tree pruning and removal to mitigate those risks. Just looking at how often your community does hazard tree inspections and mitigation. Annually, periodically, on a reactive basis, so only when you get phone calls or complaints from the citizens, or you don't regularly inspect your trees. So give everybody just a few moments to respond with how they think that their community manages their risks and mitigates them, and we'll give everybody a chance to respond here. Again, if you're not sure, just take your best guess, and we won't hold you accountable. So, all right, well, I think we've got most everybody's responses in here, so I'll close and I'll share those results here. It looks like a majority of the folks on the call either inspect and mitigate tree risks on a reactive basis, with about 39% of the folks saying that, and then 35% say they periodically. So there aren't too many that do annual inspections. 22% responded that they actually inspect their trees annually and mitigate those risks if they come across them. And then only a couple of folks on the call said their community does not regularly inspect public trees.
Okay, great. I kind of suspected that we might see a lot more on the periodically or reactive basis. A lot of our communities, especially smaller communities that don't have the capacity, don't have their own in-house crews, or don't have the capacity to hire contract crews, tend to only respond to tree risk related incidents based on a call or a complaint, a citizen calling in and saying that a tree limb broke and is now in the street, and they respond to it at that point. So hopefully going through this presentation will help you to see the benefits of doing this regular risk inspection and mitigating those risks before they become the problem, either just on a sunny, clear day when a branch breaks or during a storm event. So we're going to talk a little bit about the tree structure terminology. Again, this is just so that you understand the terms that I will be using through the presentation and talking about the various parts of the tree as we assess a tree. So I think everybody should know what the trunk of the tree is, but essentially the trunk is that portion of the tree from the roots up to at least the first branch, and that is the main trunk. Above that, we have the central stem, or we sometimes call it the central leader. And it is that portion of the tree from the first branch all the way up through the tip. Occasionally, we will have branches that fork, and we call those codominant stems or codominant leaders. They are forked branches, typically the same size and diameter, arising from a common junction, and they lack a normal branch union. From the central stem or from the trunk, we will have scaffold branches. These are the major branches coming off of the central point from the trunk or the central stem. And then off the scaffold branches, we will have branches, or sometimes we'll use the term lateral. That sometimes can also refer to a scaffold branch. We might call it a lateral branch. And then off of the branches, we have twigs. And I mentioned branch union earlier. The branch union is a union between either a scaffold branch and the trunk or central stem, or it could be between two other branches. A normal branch union should be U-shaped, shaped like the letter U, versus a V-shaped. When we get into that V-shaped union, that is a weak union, and we'll discuss that in the next slide. The crown, or also alternatively referred to as the canopy, is that portion of the tree that encompasses all of the branches and twigs and leaves in the upper portion of the tree. The root crown is that portion of the root zone where it, from the trunk, it kind of slopes outward and meets the roots. This is where our major structural roots are, the larger roots that help support the weight of the tree. And then the root zone is that portion of the roots underground and extending well beyond the crown of the tree. And for those of you who aren't aware, roots typically grow fairly shallow. Most trees do not retain a taproot, so there's no deep-rooted taproot for most tree species. Roots tend to grow within the top 6 to 18 inches of soil. So therefore, that portion of the tree can be easily damaged by excess fill, excess mulch, or construction damage, compaction, trenching and tunneling for inputting utilities. So this is an area that we have to pay close attention to when working around trees. Now I mentioned that a branch union that is V-shaped is a weak junction. And within that weak junction, we have included bark. It is bark that becomes embedded between the union, between either the branch and the trunk, or between codominant stems. And this causes weak structure because those two pieces of bark, they are not fusing together. They are not growing together. That is simply an area of split. And as this meme says it best, I guess my point is, if your tree has codominant stems with included bark, it's not going to split. It's already split. So let's talk a little bit about tree risk identification. All trees, and indeed anything in our life, anything that we do, has some risk associated with it. The key, however, is to acknowledge that there is that risk and then manage that risk to the best of our capabilities. Storm damage to trees and the risk that they pose to people and property can be minimized through tree risk assessments and mitigation. So let's again cover a little bit more terminology. I think a lot of folks use these terms interchangeably, but really they have different meanings. Hazard is a situation or condition that is likely to cause harm. Risk, on the other hand, is a combination of the likelihood that something will happen and the severity of the potential consequences. So for example, hazard would be black ice on the road in the winter. Risk is the likelihood that you hit that patch of black ice, skid, crash, your car is damaged, or you are injured. So that is the difference between hazard and risk. When we talk about tree risk assessment is a systematic process whereby we identify, analyze, and then evaluate tree risk. Risk assessment considers 3 factors. We have to have the potential for tree failure. Failure potential is the likelihood that an entire tree or part of a tree will break and fall within a given time period. We have to have an environment that may contribute to that failure, such as storms. And then we would have to have something that would be damaged or injured, a target, as a result of that failure. So risk, again, is the combination of a failure of a tree or tree part with the presence of an adjacent target. So we could say if there was no target, there is no risk. And the highest priority target is always human life. So we always have to look at the tree is not just going to hit the sidewalk when it falls, it's going to hit a person walking down the sidewalk. That's how we look at risk and target values. Tree risk evaluation is a process of comparing the assessed risk with given risk criteria to determine the significance. How significant is that risk? So visual tree assessment, and again, this is a systematic process where we are inspecting each part of the tree in a consistent order so that we don't miss something. We start at a distance. We want to look at the entire tree from a distance, and if possible, a 360 view around that tree. Walk around the tree at a distance, get a look at it from top to bottom. Then we want to zoom in, and we want to start looking from the roots and the root crown, looking up the trunk and central stem, then out to the scaffold branches, and then at the canopy, and again, looking at the whole tree from a distance. And what we're looking for are those obvious defects that I think most anybody, especially if you're train your eye to see them, would tell you, yeah, I think there's a problem with that tree. The picture here shows the arborist looking at the root zone, but you can see the obvious defect in the trunk. So again, most of these things are obvious defects to look for. So again, we're working from the bottom up. So working from the root zone, up the trunk and central stem, out to the branches, and then looking at the leaves and tree canopy. So when we're looking for the overall tree, what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for the overall appearance of the tree. Is it healthy? Does it appear to be dead, or is it dying? Do we see that the tree is leaning? And if it's leaning, has that lean corrected itself? Trees and other plants grow toward the sunlight. So sometimes you'll see trees with weird sweeps in the trunk, where maybe they were shaded at some point in their life. They grew outward toward the edge where sunlight might be available, and from there grew up straight. So if you see a tree that has kind of a curvy or sweeping trunk, that tree has corrected itself through a growth lean, trying to get to sunlight. So you want to look for lean that's not corrected by any kind of stem growth. Is it newly leaning? Last week that tree was standing upright, and today it's got a lean to it. So it's a new lean. Is it excessive? Is it 25% leaning? Is it 30%? Those are excessive leans, and that leads us to think there's possible root zone issues. We want to look at the form and structure of the tree. How are branches arranged? Trees vary in how they naturally form. Oak trees tend to be very broad spreading. Pine trees are very pyramidal, and Zelkova is a tree, Asian tree, that has more of a vase shape. So it's going to have branches that are a little more closely spaced together along the trunk to create a nice V-shaped or vase-shaped appearance. So you kind of have to look at how that form and structure, how the branches are arranged and attached. And at this point, we also want to look around the site. What is surrounding the tree? What's going on around the tree? We want to look for any potential conflicts with utilities, with sidewalks. Is there evidence of any recent disturbance, any construction impacts going on? And this is also the time where we're going to look for what are the potential targets around this tree. So now as we zoom in and look at the root structure, and again, from a distance, we notice that this tree is leaning. We want to pay close attention to the root zone and see if the tree is leaning because of some sort of root plate movement. Do you see evidence that the soil has heaved, or there's a mound of soil on the opposite side of the lean, maybe some sunken soil on the leanward side of the tree? Do we see cracks in the soil? Is there a partial uprooting? Are some of those roots actually exposed? And again, is this a recent lean? Is this something that has happened recently? In the picture on the right, we see a tree that is leaning a little bit. You can tell a little bit that the soil has mounded here. But critically, what we're looking at is the sidewalk itself. If you get to the left pointing arrow, this is the junction between older sidewalk, which is darker gray in color, and new sidewalk, which is lighter in color. So obviously this section of concrete has recently been replaced, which means potentially there was some roots cut or roots damaged as this concrete was repaired. And that is now resulting in this tree leaning. So this puts this tree at great risk of potentially failing and falling into the street, hitting a car, hitting people. So we want to look for any cut or disturbed root systems due to infrastructure conflicts while we're looking at the root system. Again, as we're looking at the roots, we're going to look for conchs or mushrooms or fruiting bodies, which indicate decay. They're not always right up on the trunk, such as the one in the lower left corner. Sometimes they are a little further out. So these are the roots that coming from this tree. There is some fungus growing there. I think that's Ganoderma, is a wood decay fungus. And this is something that tells us we've got some root rot issues. We've got things going on underground that we can't see. And this would warrant closer inspection by a certified arborist. We also want to look for any girdling roots. So these are roots that circle around the trunk of the tree and overlap roots underneath. And it kind of acts like a tourniquet. If you can imagine tying a tourniquet to the upper portion of your arm and slowly tightening it, you'd eventually lose blood flow to your fingertips. Well, the same thing kind of happens with trees. Their vein system is a thin layer of growing tissue just under the bark. And that brings nutrients down from the leaves and water and minerals up from the roots. So you've got a circling root that's putting pressure on a vein. We're not getting nutrients and water up and down the trunk of this tree, and this causes stress. I have seen trees uprooted because these girdling roots have so much cut off nutrients getting to the root system that the roots have died. So this could be a major issue if you've got a lot of girdling roots. And then we want to look for restricted rooting space. So anytime we've got trees planted between a curb and sidewalk, that's limited rooting space. The other issue I see going on with this tree, it's pretty much straight up and down in the ground. Looks kind of like a light pole in the ground. We don't see this nice root collar, this root crown swooping out from the trunk. That tree was planted too deep. So that tells me there's some other root issues potentially going on with that tree as well, and not just the lack of rooting space. So now let's move up the trunk. So what are we looking for in the trunk? Well, we're looking for any kind of cavity or evidence of decay, any opening to the outside. We're looking for cracks or splits in the main trunk. These could be old wounds from previous storms where the tree might not have failed during the storm, but especially with tornadoes, with the twisting winds, you get cracks along the trunk. We're looking for any kind of girdling or embedded objects. So obviously there was some sort of rope tied around this tree, and just like with girdling roots, this is cutting off the flow of nutrients and water up and down the trunk. This would be the weak point, in which point during a storm event, this might be the point at which the tree would fail. And then we're looking for cankers. Cankers are areas of dead, sunken, or missing bark, and it includes diseases or even mechanical wounds, such as when you run your mower or weed whacker into the trunk of the tree and create a wound. We also want to look for those conchs and fruiting bodies. A lot of the things we're looking for from the roots, we'll also be looking for up the trunk, the central stem, and the branches. So anytime you see decay, conchs, fungus on any of those structures, it's evidence of decay has entered the tree. We want to look and see if there's any insects or diseases that may be impacting the health of the tree. And when we impact health, we sometimes impact the structure of the tree as well. But diseases that cause tree mortality, wood gets weaker and more likely to break during storm events. We want to look for any vines that increase loading on the trunk or the branches, and also may girdle the stem itself, may actually wrap so tightly around the tree that it's cutting off the flow of nutrients. All right, so moving up from the trunk and central stem, we want to look for those codominant stems, those stems that are growing from a central point, nearly equal in diameter, V-shaped union with included bark. And we want to look for any splits or cracks. And as I said, if you've got a tree with codominant stems and included bark, it's not already split. It's not going to split, it's already split. It just hasn't moved apart yet. So you can see the seam coming down the tree on the far right side. But we also see on the far left, this was a codominant stem that failed at some point in the past, and this tree was left standing. But now this is our weak point. There is not enough solid wood here that would prevent this portion of the trunk, the central stem, from failing at a later point. And it may not even be a storm that takes this tree out. It could just be the weight of the leaves, and it's the force of that load on the stem that finally causes the wood to fail, and this portion of the tree would fall. So we want to look for those weak attachments and included bark. Now when we look out through the branches, and this can include our scaffold branches at the trunk attachment and our lateral branches, anything that is dead, broken, hanging by a thread, cracked, or split, those are obvious defects that pose a risk of failure. We want to look for poor branch architecture, which is multiple branches originating from a common point, either horizontally or vertically. They're too close together. They're basically competing for space. And as each trunk or each branch grows in diameter, they're putting pressure against each other and the stem. This picture in the top right corner, this was a tree that was planted under a power line. So unfortunately, over the years had been pruned to provide clearance for that power line. You can see the old pruning wounds created a large cavity, and basically the only portion left of this tree growing was this stem growing up. And if we look closer, we see on either side of that stem, it's starting to crack. So this tree was in the process of failing. So this was when this happened when I was working with Wake Forest. We called this an imminent risk of failure, and we immediately blocked off the street and removed this tree. So when we're looking at the crown, again, we're going to look for that overall decline. Are we seeing any dead branch tips? Now, just because a tree has some green leaves on it does not mean necessarily that it is alive and healthy. Anytime we have branch tips that are devoid of leaves, those branches are dead. And once they die, they don't really come back. Now, we may see sprouting a little further down where other leaves might be providing nutrients, but once we've gotten dead tips, this tree is declining. We also want to look for any insect or disease damage, which may weaken the health of the tree and therefore eventually impact its structure. We want to look for past poor pruning practices, and topping is a big one. Sprouts at the cut sites are weakly attached. Those are more likely to fail in storms. We also want to look for an unbalanced crown. And this picture on the far right was kind of an extreme example of an unbalanced crown. But anytime you've got a tree growing practically one-sided, and that could be because the tree is growing against other trees in a forested area, this tree was on the edge, and so therefore interior branches are shaded, so there are fewer and more branches growing out onto the side. And then if you were to remove the trees on the back side of that, you've got a tree that no longer has the support of the surrounding trees behind it, buffering the winds, and there's more load on this one side. This also applies to branches that may be overextended. So the canopy may be fairly symmetrical, but you've got one limb that for one reason or another has grown extremely long and has gone extremely large, and all of the leaves and branches, twigs are at the very tip. The longer the lever arm, the less force it takes to break that lever. So think about that. If you've got one limb that is very long and all the weight is at the end, it's going to take a lot less force to break that limb than if that limb were a little shorter. So now let's talk about mitigation. What actions can we take to reduce risk? we've got two options. We've got tree-based and target-based. Tree-based, we're looking to reduce the likelihood of failure or the likelihood of impact. And we can do that through pruning, cabling, bracing, or propping. We can do that through removal. And more importantly, we can do that through site conditions as well, improving site conditions. Target-based is reducing the likelihood of impact or consequences. And we can do that through moving the target, if that is practical, or eliminate or restrict access or use of the target zone. These strategies can sometimes be temporary in nature until such time as, let's say, pruning needed to happen. So we want to restrict access to the target zone until a crew can come out and mitigate the risk through pruning or removal or what other option. So for our mitigation pruning strategies, some other terms to be familiar with are crown cleaning. This is the removal of broken, dead, dying, defective, or weakly attached branches. So that's what we call crown cleaning. We're getting rid of the poor branches. For those overextended branches, we might want to do a reduction cut, which is just shortening the branch to reduce load. So this top photo is, we could call that crown cleaning. We're removing the entire limb, probably because it was defective, or maybe we had a weak branch attachment. In the lower photo, we're actually removing this central stem portion, because that was the portion that was overextended, unbalanced, the crown was weaker. So we were reducing that limb down to the parent branch, and we're leaving the lateral branch off to the side. And then crown raising is removing lower branches that may be damaging structures or obstructing passage. Now, crown raising does not necessarily reduce risk associated with tree failure. However, if lower limbs are being damaged by vehicles, such as the garbage truck is repeatedly hitting a branch that's growing a little bit low over the street, it creates a wound, which could pose a risk later in the future if that wound, decay gets in that wound, or otherwise the load on the limb fails at that wound point. Now let's talk about topping. And I love this graphic. Topping is for ice cream, not for trees. Topping is the indiscriminate cutting of tree branches to stubs or lateral branches that are too small to maintain the energy in the rest of that limb. Other terms that may be used are heading or tipping, hat racking, rounding over, or shaping. And it is never, I don't care how often you see it, never an acceptable pruning practice, and that includes crepe myrtles. Topping is also not an appropriate storm damage mitigation option. Topping stresses trees by removing the energy producing leaves. It forces rapid growth in multiple shoots, which are more vulnerable to breaking during storms and can lead to unacceptable risk. Other mitigation strategies include support structures such as cables, which are more flexible braces installed to limit the movement of weak junctions or codominant stems. Brace rods installed close to or through those weak junctions or split sections. We can use guys if a tree is leaning. We can guide the tree to help improve anchorage and stabilize the lean, or props, which are supported below the leaning tree or low branch from below. Cabling and bracing, I would more recommend for trees that you would consider more high value in your community. Maybe they have some historical significance, it's a heritage tree, because these systems need to be frequently inspected to make sure that they are still functioning and that how the tree is responding to those structures being installed. And one con to some of these support structures is they can actually create more issues than they solve, because if they limit movement too much, then the tree can't sway in the wind like it's designed to, and that may put more load on the root system during windstorms. And removal is always an option when those trees pose an unacceptable risk to people or property, and you cannot mitigate that risk otherwise. Trees are in poor condition or are declining. If you can't reasonably treat insects and disease issues, or they're competing with other values, those are when removal would be an acceptable mitigation option. And then modifying the site to improve tree health. So if you don't have any of those major issues going on, you can help your trees by just properly mulching them, improving drainage, enlarging the planter openings if you can, modifying irrigation and reducing soil compaction. And in these photographs, an arborist is using an air spade to expose the root system and cutting some of those girdling roots to eliminate that issue in the future. And another acceptable mitigation strategy is just frequent monitoring. Go back annually or biannually, looking for changes in tree condition in annual fruiting bodies. And target management. Again, if you can move or remove the target or restrict access, that is also a mitigation strategy. However, the best mitigation strategy starts the day the tree is planted. So properly planting, selecting the site, selecting the tree, site preparation, proper maintenance through planting or through watering, mulching, and pruning all start when the tree is young. And if you do this from the beginning, when the tree is put in the ground, it has a higher chance of resisting most storm damage. Now, it's not going to prevent the severe storms, but for our most storm events, our everyday thunderstorms, it should stand up a lot better. So our second poll question, I know I'm running a little bit over, Leslie.
Yep, no worries. We'll do this pretty quickly here. So how likely is your community to implement regular tree assessment and mitigation plan? Jennifer wants to know how impactful her presentation has been in convincing you to start doing regular tree assessment. So I'll give everybody just a few seconds here to get their response in. Be honest, no harm, no foul on this one. Not going to offend anybody. Just give us your response here. All right, just a few more seconds. I think most everybody has responded. And here we go. We will go ahead and share those results. It looks like we have 38% of the folks say that they're somewhat likely to implement regular tree assessment and mitigation plan, followed closely with the 29% response for likely. 14% say very likely, and then we have 19% saying not likely.
Okay, so we got a little bit of work to do there. All right, and finally, Andy's covered many of these resources, so I'm not going to rehash them. But one resource that might be beneficial, especially if you've got tree crews that might be doing this work, is the Evaluating Tree Defects Field Guide by Ed Hayes. So far, the only place I could find to order it was the safetrees.com website, and I think it was $30. So with that, I will end and ask if there are any questions.
All right, very good. Yep, just type your questions in that question panel box. We did have one question that came in while you were talking, Jennifer, asking specifically, how would you mitigate by improving site conditions?
Okay, so that starts really with trees that don't have those major defects. This starts with trees that you identify as maybe being stressed, but you don't see any of the indicators that I covered. Anytime you improve tree health, you make a tree more resilient. Trees that are stressed are more vulnerable to insects, disease, and storms, and other impacts from our urban environment. So you can improve those conditions, you can improve the chances that those trees may better survive a storm through those site conditions, especially if you can eliminate the soil compaction so that roots have a better place to grow. Roots help the tree stay up in the ground through friction with the small, fine roots. And so if the soil is compacted and roots can't grow very far, or they can't get a little deeper into the soil, if you've got trees that have a lot of surface roots, they can't get down a little bit further into the soil, those more likely to experience wind throw in certain conditions. Again, anytime you can improve the tree health and you can prevent the tips of those branches from dying, then you prevent the branch death that eventually becomes the